So a few days ago, I decided to do a pair of live streams for my first time ever playing through Popgoes Arcade. For these streams, I was accompanied by my good friend Lyra Horrors, as well as the game's lead director Kane Carter, and needless to say, these streams were interesting.
The tolerant left. That's 'cause you're a beta male, Sonic.
All jokes aside though, while I had originally gone into this stream expecting a more fun, laid-back experience, I quickly became surprised by just how invested I was in Popgoes Arcade as a game. The game's deceptively simple mechanics in both the overworld and combat slowly grew in complexity over time, creating an extremely enjoyable and challenging experience. As well as this, I found myself extremely interested in the story, with what originally seemed like a goofy little adventure slowly transforming into something far deeper and more complex than I ever could have imagined. And then of course, there was another little aspect of the game which came into play later on that completely caught me off guard. I swear to God, if this is just a wild goose chase and there's nothing special in this well, I'm paranoid now. What the fuck? But we'll get into that a little bit later. In this video, I plan to go over Popgoes Arcade and how it completely subverted my expectations in all the best ways possible. I plan to go over its gameplay, story, and all the twists and turns that come with them to hopefully shed some light on what I view as being an extremely underrated RPG. So, without further ado, let's delve into it. So before I delve into any of the specifics about Popgoes Arcade, I'd like to first talk about what this game even is. Popgoes Arcade is a retro-style RPG which was released on Steam July 1st, 2022 as part of the Fazbear Fanverse initiative. The game was released as a sort of precursor to the game Popgoes Evergreen, serving the purpose of setting up the main events of that game, as well as being a fully fledged RPG experience in and of itself. The idea behind what we find ourselves doing over the course of Popgoes Arcade is pretty simple. We find ourselves in a top-down, retro-style overworld where we're able to roam around this massive map, fighting random enemies we encounter in each zone along the way. Our objective in both the main game, as well as the Machinist expansion, revolve around us the player traveling to the west, south, and east forests to fight a whole slew of special enemies in order to gain access to the different items we'll need to get to the final boss. Defeat the final boss of both halves of the game, and there you have it, the game is finished. Now, after hearing that description, you can probably imagine why I felt the way I did going into it. It's not that I expected something bad, no, in fact I expected to have a very fun time with it, but with how simple the premise and mechanics behind the game seemed at first, I didn't expect anything that was going to blow me away. But I am not exaggerating when I say that I have never been so wrong about a game in my life. Both the story and mechanics of this game when viewed at a surface level seem fairly bare bones compared to some other RPGs out there. However, actually delving into the game reveals its true nature to you, providing you with an extremely complex experience both in how it chooses to tell its story, as well as how it challenges you. Let's take a look at what I mean, starting with the gameplay. The gameplay of Popgoes Arcade, more specifically the combat, starts out as straightforward as you can get for an RPG. It follows a turn-based system where we and the enemy both take turns attacking one another until one of us hits 0 hit points. On our turns, we have one of 3 options. We can either block to reduce the damage of the enemy's next attack, attack the enemy, or use an item we have in our bag. On the enemy's turn, they can choose one of 2 options. They can either attack us normally, or they can charge up a special attack that will do triple damage. There is a bit of nuance to these fights that I didn't really mention, but that pretty much sums up what a basic encounter looks like in the early game. This combat system, while not exactly being anything too complicated on its own, quickly made me excited at the potential it had to innovate on itself with later encounters. And innovate it did. The bosses that we fight over the course of the base game and the Machinist expansion completely change the way we go about encounters. Every single one of these fights introduces a completely new mechanic which forces us to think up new strategies as to how we're going to defeat them. Take for example, Foxy, who on every third turn is able to do an attack that does triple damage. In this fight, we have to plan every single move we make around that third turn where we know the hook is coming, making everything we do in the time beforehand extremely important. Make one wrong move against Foxy and, well... I am kind of pathetic. Oh, wow! That was all of my health at once! And this design principle is present with every single boss that we fight, with each one having a more creative and challenging mechanic than the last. My favorite example of how the game innovates on itself is the Dead King Freddy fight at the end of the base game. This fight is so creative to me because of how both his attacks, as well as the arena we fight him in, are used to great effect as mechanics. You see, in the background of the fight, there are these red lasers that will flash 3 times before shifting to either a yellow or a purple color. If you hit Freddy while the laser is yellow, you'll deal bonus damage. Attack while it's purple though, and Freddy will instead reflect the attack back at you. What makes this mechanic so cool to me is not only the fact that timing your attacks with the lasers feels incredibly satisfying, but also that there's a level of randomness to it. You don't know whether or not the laser will be yellow or purple by the time you do an attack, which means that every single time you try to use this mechanic, it's a gamble. A gamble that I found myself becoming extremely addicted to despite my Chad and Kane's efforts to make me stop.
I dig this game so hard, I want a little statue of that man.
Oh! Damn it!
Ooh. Are those things like in the Dead Forest?
No!
Is there a specific place I have to unlock those abilities?
I have a general strategy for this. The problem is just that I really like gambling with the potential damage with my hook, and that gambling, it keeps getting me killed. You see, like, now my run's just straight up over. Bosses like this one, and especially some later ones in the Machinist, serve to make the combat of this game far more complex and challenging than I ever would have expected going into it. It shows how by building a game on a simple foundation, you can really innovate and build something interesting if you know how to use that foundation well. And the team behind this game definitely knew what they were doing when making these fights. The fights themselves aren't the only thing that grow in complexity over the course of the game, though. After we defeat each respective boss, the game actually gives us that boss's ability to use in both combat as well as the overworld. These abilities range from being able to jump over attacks, being able to use Foxy's hook, or being able to dig up useful items in a pinch. As well as this, they become useful tools we can use in the overworld to reach new locations that weren't originally possible, giving the game an almost Metroidvania-esque approach to its map design that I absolutely adore. It really feels like after each boss we defeat, we're always rewarded with some kind of new ability that makes both encounters and exploring far more entertaining and convenient than they were without them. Giving the player more options also, of course, opens up new gateways for the bosses to have new mechanics to exploit and punish them when used improperly, making it feel like the game and the player are both becoming stronger and harder to deal with alongside each other, making progression feel extremely satisfying with each challenge you overcome. I also found that each new tool you got never really overshadowed another in usefulness. No matter what stage in the game I found myself in, I felt like every single new ability and item came in handy, with many of the hardest battles I faced only being beatable by properly using everything I had at my disposal. It really feels like each tool we have was taken into consideration with how many of the bosses were designed in Popgoes Arcade, making it feel like everything has a reason to be there and nothing was half-baked. To end off this discussion about the overall game design, I'd like to talk about something that I find personally really interesting about the power-ups and tools we're provided after each fight. That being that we don't actually have to use them. Yeah, those abilities we can gain, upgrades to our health and damage, items, the game doesn't actually force us to use any of them. What this effectively means for the game is that the difficulty of the experience isn't decided by some normal, easy, or hard mode, but rather it's based entirely on how easy or hard the player wants to make it on themselves for a bigger challenge. The average player who wants a more medium difficulty experience will naturally take whatever tools they can to make each fight more manageable. However, someone who's already beaten the game and is looking for a greater challenge can begin neglecting certain power-ups and abilities just to see how far they can get without them. It's this ability to allow the player to impose these challenges upon themselves that I feel gives Popgoes Arcade a level of replayability that some RPGs don't have without this being a system. By giving the player the ability to create their own challenges, they can experiment with what the hardest challenge is to beat, giving an insane amount of content to those like myself who love a good challenge. The gameplay of Popgoes Arcade completely blew me away when I really got into the game, providing me with both an extremely entertaining and challenging experience that I definitely intend on revisiting several times in the future. But it wasn't just the gameplay which completely subverted my expectations, which is why I'd love to take the time to discuss quite possibly my favorite part of the entire game, the story. Much like the gameplay I discussed beforehand, I feel like the story of Popgoes Arcade when viewed at a surface level is not given the proper justice it deserves. What seems at first like a simple story used solely to push the player forward in a fun arcade experience slowly evolves into something far more deep and complex than you ever would expect going into it. And I feel like that shift happens as soon as we've defeated the regular versions of Bonnie, Foxy, and Chica. After defeating those three initially, we learn that in order to enter Freddy's castle, we must defeat them a second time since they've all risen from the dead. As we make our way to challenge each again, we see that they've transformed into these ghastly skeletal versions of themselves, somehow brought back to life by a supernatural force. When this happens, it sparks a whole mystery in the player's mind as to what force it was that brought these enemies back. None of the characters seem to know how it happened, and the bosses themselves don't give us many hints either. It's only after defeating them all a second time and making our way into Freddy's castle that we learn the grim truth. Reading Freddy's old journals and notes, we're able to learn that he had been experimenting with the idea of coming back from the dead. These experiments conducted originally by his father allowed Freddy to learn that those murdered by another person are able to come back from the dead as a sort of second chance at life. He'd also learned through these experiments and being exposed to the ghost of his own father, that those who spend too much time around these ghostly entities begin to become corrupted, which explains why the enemies in each area become more powerful after the bosses come back to life. Now, there are a couple of details present in this story that are insanely interesting to me. The first being how it explains all the events that occur throughout the actual game. We see enemies become stronger through corruption, and old bosses we previously defeated come back as undead with little to no explanation at first. So to get to the end of the first campaign and have it all explained to you in a very concise manner as build up to the final boss is extremely satisfying, as it makes everything that happened during the game make sense. The second, and possibly more interesting detail about this story though, is how it can be taken in two completely different contexts. While most will view the story as being written in the context of the arcade machine, others may notice how these notes and books seem to be detailing the rules of possession in the Popgoes timeline. Coming back from the dead through murder, corrupting those around you after returning as a ghost, these are details that are very clearly present within both the arcade machine story, as well as the story of the Popgoes universe as a whole. And if you don't believe me, then let's take a look at quite possibly the most disturbing part of the entire game, which proves what I'm talking about. So when I was playing through the game for the first time, around halfway through my stream, Kane started acting weird in my chat, to say the least. He started asking me to interact with this one well I could find in the South Forest, and out of curiosity I decided to see what would happen. Initially, nothing did, but after interacting with it enough, this happened. I remembered to save! Come on. Show me something cool in the well. I swear to God, if this is just a wild goose chase and there's nothing special in this well, I'm paranoid now. What the fuck? I don't like why the music stopped. That little Easter egg completely caught me off guard, because up to that point in the game, nothing like it had happened yet. Little did I realize that was just the beginning of something far more disturbing, which I would only learn about while traversing Freddy's castle. While making my way through the final level, I saw a message from Kane talking about how he was embarrassed by a glitched wall texture he noticed in the far left wall. Thinking that was a really weird comment to make on his part, I went to investigate, which led to this happening. Oh hey, yeah, what's that? What? What the fuck?
What the fuck? Huh?
What? 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 After that, I decided we were gonna hold off on the whole final boss thing, because I had really badly wanted to see where this key would take me. And with the help of my chat, I eventually figured out that the key was needed to be used on the bird bath, which led to this happening.
Kane, if you're listening, Lester, tell us just some
What
fucking footage from Grizzlies
What?
2.
What? What? What the?
Wait, what?
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 This was when I started to realize what was going on. Anyone familiar with the original Popgoes game from 2016 would know how Popgoes AI used to work in that game. His entire gimmick was that he'd move from room to room trying to collect parts to eventually put together a Shadow Bonnie animatronic called the Black Rabbit, which would lead to a game over if he was able to collect all the parts. When we, the player, use the key on the bird bath, we take on the role of Popgoes in that original game, as it's revealed to us that the arcade cabinet we've been playing is actually haunted with the spirit of the Black Rabbit. We must then traverse the map collecting her parts and bringing them back to the bird bath to summon her, which then leads us to a very familiar set of locations to those well versed in the lore of FNAF 3. Once we're here, we can start an encounter with a Black Rabbit who takes on the form of a corrupted Bonnie sprite. There are two ways this fight can end, either by attacking her or being passive. Attacking her, which was my first instinct when encountering this fight, led to this happening. What's this? What? Bonnie? Are you the ones who beat the... What? 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 What the? What? What?! No way! This is quite possibly one of the coolest moments to ever come out of any FNAF media. Seeing the game take full advantage of the arcade cabinet HUD was an insanely cool detail that very clearly made me lose my mind when I first saw it. For that reason, this moment will forever be ingrained in my mind for the sheer surprise of it. After this insane cutscene, Kane told me that I could go back to that fight and something different would happen if I was a pacifist. So I followed his advice and I learned the truth of how Bonnie ended up in the machine. By not attacking her, we can actually start a conversation with the spirit in the machine, which reveals to us how she got there. We learn that she was murdered only a few nights prior to us playing the game by someone wielding an axe. This led to her coming back as a spirit which haunted the arcade. Eventually, while her soul lingered in the establishment, it got trapped inside the machine where we then came and found it. At the end of the conversation, the spirit's soul seemingly vanishes from the cabinet forever. This cutscene proves my point about how Freddy's journals can be taken in two different contexts. Not only does it serve as an explanation for the events that happen in the arcade machine, but it also gives us context as to how the spirit of Bonnie ended up possessing it in the first place. We know that she was the victim of a murder, which is something that gets even further proven to us with this nightmare-inducing Easter egg in The Machinist. Oh, no way! What? What? Her death at the hands of another person is what led to her ghost haunting the establishment, which is seemingly going to be the most important plot point of Popgoes Evergreen. All of this context and all of these important pieces of lore are provided to us under the veil of being the story of a fun little arcade game, which is one of the coolest ways I've ever seen a story get told. And it was this insanely meta way of storytelling combined with the terrifying atmosphere of these moments which made me absolutely obsessed with this game, leading to the video you're watching right now. Well, that and Morse the Mole. Morse is the best character ever made from any official FNAF media, and I will not take any criticism on that claim. All jokes aside though, I hope that this discussion on Popgoes Arcade has piqued your interest in what this amazing game has to offer. What seems like a very simple retro RPG on the surface quickly turned into one of my favorites I've ever played, all thanks to its gameplay and writing. Popgoes Arcade is a game that I fully intend to continue revisiting in the future, all thanks to the many challenges it proposes with how it's designed, as well as how endearing the world that it created is. If you haven't bought the game yet and still have the $5 lying around to do so, I highly recommend it. There's still so much that I haven't even covered in this video that will be there for you to uncover yourself, and I'd love to have more people discussing this game. And if what I talked about already in this video wasn't reason enough to try the game, there's also Morse the Mole.
It's Morse the Mole! Let's go!
I was right! I was right!
Aw, look at him! Look at him!
Yeah.
He looks so fucking cool!
I'm so happy! I'm so happy I was right! Oh my god!
It's been so long. Popgoes the Weasel.
Ah, big sip of water! Oh my god!